Afternoon from London, but I know we have a global audience joining us today. So good morning, good afternoon, or even good evening, wherever you are joining us from. And welcome to today's webinar, which is all about how to make government more productive to protect public services when budgets are tight. I'm Siobhan Benita. I'm a former UK civil servant, and I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar on behalf of Global Government Forum, which is a publishing house that serves civil servants all around the world. And I'd also like to thank our knowledge partner today, which is Unit 4. So in terms of that topic of today's webinar, governments around the world are really tightening their spending plans as global economic growth remains slow. This means that finance departments, finance ministries are having to really look at restricting spending on new projects, at examining existing plans, and looking to make savings on day-to-day spendings. So some governments avoided the need to make substantial savings, for example, following the 2008 financial crisis, but others didn't. And for all of them, I think, but especially those that already went through this process, there are really very few easy cuts left to be made. So this is quite a big challenge. In this session today, we're going to be looking at how those finance departments can plan public spending in a way that protects public services, how departments can work together more effectively to make services more efficient for everybody, and also maybe the potential for technology to help drive up productivity and still protect public services. We've got three fantastic speakers with us here today, and in a moment I'm going to introduce each of our speakers and then ask them to give us some opening remarks. But once they have spoken, it's your opportunity as our audience to put your questions to our panel. So on whichever device you are using, you should see a Q&A button somewhere. Please use that Q&A button from now on, at any point from now on, to message in your questions. And we'll get through as many of your questions or comments as we can before the end of the webinar. So in terms of our fantastic panel, so first we will hear from Bart van Ark, who is Professor of Productivity Studies at the Alliance Manchester Business School at the University of Manchester and Managing Director of the Productivity Institute. It's an institute which brings together academic research, policy studies, and business engagement. Bart is also a senior advisor of the Economy, Strategy and Finance Centre at the Conference Board, an honorary professor at the Faculty of Economics and Business at the University of Groningen, and a member of the Research Review Group at the International Labour Organization. Then we will hear from Mark Gibbison, who is the Global Head of Public Sector for our Knowledge Partner Unit 4. And Mark is passionate about helping the public sector to develop improved services at a lower cost using modern enterprise technology. He's previously held senior positions in local government, working in IT, corporate policy and performance management, as well as with technology vendors such as SAP and Objective Corporation, where he was head of UK enterprise sales. And last but by no means least, we will hear from Christian Weiser, who is Head of Unit for National Fiscal Frameworks and Institutions in the Directorate General for Economic and Financial Affairs at the European Commission. Christian gained broad experience in economic surveillance, being Head of Unit for Portugal, Ireland and Denmark, and he also led work on preparing the adoption of the euro in Latvia. Previously, he's worked at the European Commission on cohesion policy and the budget, as well as on national microeconomic policies to enhance competitiveness. And before joining the European Commission in 2003, he covered European economic integration at the German Institute for Economic Research. So I'm sure you'll agree with me, we really do have a fantastic expert panel with us here today. As I said, please take up this opportunity to message in your questions. We want to make this as interactive as possible, and we'll get to those questions once we've heard from our speakers. So on that note, Bart, I'm coming over to you. I'm going to invite you to kick us off by giving us your opening thoughts.
Thank you very much, Johan, and thank you for inviting me to what is a truly important and big topic. And you've been asked me to give a little bit of a big picture to opening this up. But I'd like to step back a little bit and just share with you some recent experience here in the UK, where I am based, and several of the audience as well. But I think what we're seeing here is representative for quite a few countries. Public sector productivity has become an increasingly important part of government policy. With the increased demand for public services, with aging societies, the demand for public services is going to go up. And we can't just spend ourselves just out of this. We will have to think about the productivity side of this as well. And this has also been recognized by the UK government. The Chancellor of the Exchequer last year announced a program to increase public sector productivity by 0.5% a year. And then in the budget that the Chancellor produced last week, he actually added another 800 million to public service investment in order to get a 1.8 billion revenue and return out of that over a period of 5 years, but also added another 3.4 billion to digitize the National Health Service. So those are really very big initiatives, and I think we're seeing similar initiatives in other countries, which I'm sure we'll also discuss a little bit later. Now, there is some good news in those type of announcements because it does recognize the importance of public sector productivity as one way to manage the growth of the public sector, which, as I said, will continue to increase quite significantly. It also recognizes the importance of investment, that productivity growth does require investment and does require additional funding. You cannot just look for waste and for slack, although there's probably some of that in any kind of organization, but it does also require investment. It is recognized that this was an announcement for a period of 5 years. So it does recognize that you can't always go for quick results, that public sector productivity does need a longer time frame, and even a 5-year period, I think, is a minimum here. And then finally, I'm sure this is something that my co-panelists will also address. It has recognized the importance of technology. There is absolutely scope for technological improvements in the public sector, and I think that recognition really matters. So these are really all important things to show that productivity has to be part of the solution, although again, it cannot completely replace the need for continue to invest in this sector. The other good news is that we can increase public sector productivity. In the UK, for example, before the pandemic, in the 2010, since the global financial crisis and the start of the pandemic, public sector productivity in the UK increased by 0.7% per year. In fact, it was even somewhat faster than the productivity growth in the private sector, which was notoriously slow in the case of the UK. Now, what's interesting here is that of that 0.7%, about 1/3 of that was actually related to improvements in the quality of public services. The other 2/3 was coming from getting waste and slack and efficiency improvements into the system. Much of those productivity improvements tended to be concentrated in healthcare and in education, which is probably partly because those are sectors that do have a lot of scope for productivity improvements. But, and I think this is important, it's also because those are the sectors where our national statisticians tend to measure productivity somewhat better than in other public services. So in healthcare, for example, in the UK, we now measure healthcare output by activities. We adjust them for quality improvements, whereas in many other public service sectors, we tend to still make a sort of input is output assumption. And then, of course, by definition, you don't have much productivity growth. This in itself is a bit of a frustration for many public sector leaders, because if public sector leaders see productivity improvements in their own organizations, but they don't see it translated to the national statistics, that's not very motivating. And I think it's one cause for some skepticism about some of these public sector improvement plans. But I think we have to be honest and also agree that public sector productivity is not a particular easy thing to do. And there are a couple of reasons why that is the case, which I will briefly go into. One is that in the public sector, it's quite often we see that we're not very clear about the purpose of public sector improvements. So sometimes, and a lot of this is coming by, we need to manage cost, we need to deal with the rising public debt of the system, and those are important things, and we need to get it quickly, so we need to look for waste and for slack in the system. It doesn't recognize the other important reason for public sector productivity, which is that it actually helps the rest of the economy. Just think of a productive infrastructure sector, a productive healthcare sector, a productive education system. All these things will help the productivity of the private sector enormously, and that should definitely be part of the equation. So purpose matters. Secondly, it's important for public sector leaders to take a more holistic view of their productivity opportunities. You can think of a public sector organization as a delivery chain or a pipeline where you go from budget to inputs to outputs to outcomes. And along that whole delivery chain, you can get productivity gains. You can get productivity gains from better procurement. You can get productivity gains from applying technology in order to turn your outputs into inputs into good outputs. But you can also increase the effectiveness of your public services by making better use of information you get from citizens and from customers. So thinking across the opportunities that you have across your delivery chain, think more holistically about public sector productivity would help a lot. Thirdly, it's really hard in public services to join up resources, to just think about that productivity has to come with a lot of changes in organizations that need to happen at the same time. Too many projects are often one-off initiatives, a new technology application, a tweak in the process, but then doesn't come together with improvements in the skills of the workforce or changes in the flexibility of organizations. I'm sure today we will talk about the role of artificial intelligence in public services. And again, there's a lot of hype around this, how big this will be. But we have to realize that AI applications will have to come with improvement in digital skills of the workforce. It will have to create much more flexible organizations that are able to reallocate resources where they have the biggest opportunities. And then finally, what's really hard in the public sector is to scale up. There's lots of initiatives at the local level, in local councils, or in England, where, for example, we have 43 police forces, and there's a little initiative in one police force, but then to scale it up to get true productivity effects is difficult. But on the other hand, sometimes we have too big projects, particularly in technology, where we have a grand plan, but don't think about how the implementation of that at a more decentralized level is happening. So some of these challenges we can manage through better process management, through better investment plans and resources, through prioritization. Other things are more difficult because public sector organizations are complex organizations, quite often with multiple outcomes. Of course, we love to talk about the passport office as being a good example of doing great productivity, but they only do one product, which is produce passports. If you take local councils, they produce multiple outcomes, and it becomes much harder to do this. So some things are difficult to control. Also, the amount of public scrutiny and political control is a constraint for those sectors. But I think that the biggest inhibitor, and that's where I will finish my opening remarks, the biggest inhibitor is the fact that we lack a culture of continuous innovation in public sector organizations. We tend to think from one initiative to the next initiative. We throw something into the organization, hope we get the productivity gains. Whereas we know that productive organizations are organizations that have this continuous thinking around how we can innovate, improve our products and services, how can we learn from the user experience, how can we be a true learning organization that is applying those. I think changing that culture is important. Once you do that, you can get short-term results and you won't do it at the cost of the longer term. So I hope we'll get a little bit more opportunity to talk about those bigger challenges on how we can create that kind of culture of innovation in public sector organizations to deliver better products and better services to our citizens.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much. That's a brilliant way to set the scene. You've covered so many issues there, given us a lot of food for thought. So I like what you said there about we have to invest in productivity. You can't just do this through getting rid of waste or getting rid of slack. It's going to take time, so you have to allow for that as well. And there is scope for technology to help. You also said we've seen that we can do this. You mentioned in the UK, we've seen that we can be improving our productivity across the public sector, but it's not easy. And some of the challenges that you have said there are you need clarity on your objectives. So what are you trying to do? Not just about reducing costs, but also about helping productivity in the wider economy and across the private sector, taking that holistic view right across the policy process and the delivery kind of landscape. Joining up resources, never easy across the public sector. We've seen that collaborating more, the skills agenda, looking to kind of embrace some of those new technologies. You're only going to be able to do that if we're all working better together. And then how do you scale up across the public sector to take those pockets of good practice? And finally, I love the note that you ended on there, that the culture has to change. We have to become continuous innovators. So really looking at how we do this. Brilliant way to start. Thank you. We've already got questions in, which I will come back to, but you can all be thinking about a really lovely first question that has come in, which I'll ask you all afterwards, is how do you measure public sector productivity? I think that's a really great question that we will kick off with. But Mark, I'm coming to you now.
Okay, thank you, Siobhan. And yeah, thanks for inviting me to be here today. Absolutely delighted. A little bit about Unit 4 before I start with my opening comments. Unit 4 is a truly global organization. We're specialists in enterprise resource planning tools, but let me break that down to you. It's basically fully integrated systems for finance, procurement, HR and projects. A lot of the areas which Bart touched upon in terms of those areas where there are potential for productivity gains within public sector organisations. We work predominantly in 4 core regions, those being the UKI, continental Europe, the Nordics, and North America, primarily Canada in North America. And we actually work with well over 1,000, I think at last count it was about 1,200 public sector organisations from the whole range. So health services, lots and lots of local authorities or municipalities, as well as central government, education services, etc. And I think, it's never been a more difficult time for public sector. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And, we've been talking about public sector, the phrase doing more with less, or even doing more with the same, has been around for many, many years. But I, for one, have never, ever known a time where, if you look just at the UK, where I'm from, there are so many local authorities who are in quite a financial situation at the moment, very close to issuing Section 114s, which basically means giving notice to government that they cannot balance the books, and there are issues there with the situation in the organisation. And why has it become so hard to balance the books? Well, we all know of the pressures that have been coming down, the COVID, the different issues with migration, etc. But ultimately, I think it comes down to the absolute strain that we're seeing on those public services, and the need for organisations to become more productive has never been true. We cannot continue just slicing the budgets, dipping into our reserves, cutting services, taking staff out. I think those days have gone. From my background in a local authority where I worked for 7 years, almost 20 years ago, it was the same message. Year on year savings coming down, and I think now is the time to look at a step change. And I think actually the announcement in the UK around government in this productivity plan that all organisations, local authorities specifically, need to have by July is a very, very pertinent time to actually take back a step back and reflect. Because as Bart said, there is investment, and we need investment in public sector to actually take that leap to become much more efficient, much more effective, and much more productive. And I think it gives us an opportunity to take a realistic look at where we want to be. It's not just short-term funding, as Bart said, it's a 5-year funding, it's a plan, and it gives us an opportunity. Now, we've been through these cycles before, and Unit 4 actually sponsor every couple of years what we call the State of the Digital Nation report, and I think we're going to circulate that as part of the follow-up in this forum as well. And it looks at the focus of digital transformation. We ask, we go out and we interview 300 or more public sector officials from many, many organisations across all factors of government, both here and in other regions. And we really talk to them about, where are you with your digital transformation plans? Because let's face it here, productivity gains are only going to be made by holistic digital transformation within organisations. And quite interestingly, we do this every 2 years. And what we've seen this year, when we did it in 2023 compared to 2021, is rather than accelerating digital change and digital transformation in organisations, the pace of change is actually slowed. So that actually organisations are now slowing down. And that's probably because of the economic situation that people are finding themselves in. Mm. But what technologies are out there to actually, give us an opportunity to actually achieve that digital transformation, and then for our organisations to become more productive? Well, there's no doubt that SaaS technologies, and I don't like to use artificial intelligence because I think it scares the life out of a lot of people. And I actually call it automated intelligence, because that's what it's about. It's about using machine learning, collaborative solutions, and combining that with automated intelligence to actually become a lot more predictive about the type of repetitive work that public sector workers, public sector users are actually going to have to do. So rather than have to go into the system and do these repetitive administrative tasks, let's use the system, let's use the automated intelligence and machine learning to actually send messages out to the organization to actually make them more efficient. We have a concept of within Unit 4 of, well, how do we want our end users to interact with the system? How do we want our government users to interact with the system? We have this concept of a 10-second interaction, whereby, you know, if you can't do what you need to do, as be it put an expense claim in or approve an invoice, then, you know, if you can't do that within 10 seconds, then actually that's wasted time, it's wasted efficiency, and you're not as productive as you could be. And what other things do these do utilizing you know, modern technologies allow? Well, certainly, Bart talked about siloed information and having information that was very hard to get and join up across facets of government, often within the same organization. So clearly, technology can help deliver insight and transparency. It offers opportunities for cost reduction and efficiency gains based on measured outcomes, and those measured outcomes being very different across the different facets of government. It's very, given the breadth of services that local authorities do, it's much harder for them to manage outputs and outcomes over the variety of services they do, as say something like the NHS, you know, which is a key set of KPIs. I think the center one there on my bullet is really, really important as well. That, you know, when we talk about digital transformation, there's no doubt that it is a huge impact on an organization. And one of the biggest impacts is when you're trying to implement a new solution, you know, extended what we do across finance, procurement, projects, HR, payroll. It's huge. And where many organizations make a mistake is that they actually forget that companies like ours, given the experience that we've had, the breadth of knowledge that we've had working globally with public sector organizations, we know what works and we know what doesn't work. And actually what we see in the past is, you know, many solutions and many implementations of these big digital transformation projects fail. And a lot of the time they fail because organizations try to model the system rather than adopting the system's processes. They try and model the system to be very much like what they do today, the previous system that they're replacing, you know, the reason they have to do things the way they've always done them. And that's why at Unit 4 we have a mantra of, look, let's adopt, not adapt. Our solutions come with pre-built models for all elements of government in all regions, and they're built on best practice that we've gained over the years. And then I think the final thing just that I want to touch upon is, you know, we've got to ensure their fiscal stability within our public sector organizations. And the only way we can do that is to have really strong financial analytical solutions in place that allow you to plan, rebudget, model for change, model your what-if scenarios, and build lots and lots of different financial modeling scenarios so that you're actually ready for the next impact, the next big thing that's coming along. So that's my final sort of point at the moment. I think technology certainly has a place to play. Technology is absolutely vital in underpinning productivity gains across all aspects of public sector, but we must adopt a different way and approach to implementing those technologies across the organizations to get the best out of them.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mark. So really building on, I think, what Bart said there in terms of setting out that the context at the moment that you've not seen it this challenging before. So in particular, mentioning, for example, in the UK, how many local governments are facing potential bankruptcy is just giving kind of setting the scene. And that we can't meet this. The solution isn't just to keep cutting services, to keep slashing budgets. We really need to look at how we can become more productive, how we can become more efficient. As you mentioned there, time for a real step change. We will circulate, you mentioned the digital transformation, the State of the Nation report. We will circulate that, and Bart, I think we'll circulate some of the things that you mentioned as well. And then Mark really stressing there how important new technologies can be in being part of the solution here. So reducing costs, helping deliver insights, being more transparent, helping people to share information. But actually, as you said, no point bringing in these new technologies if you're just kind of using them to tweak inefficient processes. You really need to be transforming the way that you do things with these new technologies. Thank you so much, Mark. And you ended there on saying it's all important ensuring fiscal stability. So I think that's a brilliant way for us to bring in Christian. Christian, we are coming over to you now.
Thank you very much, Siobhan, and many thanks for having me here. Always good to, let's say, stay in touch over the channel. Yes, I wanted to...
Don't mention Brexit, Christian. It makes me sad every time.
I didn't use the word. So I just wanted to give you a bit of an overview on how we approach this issue of how national fiscal frameworks work at the EU level. Maybe if you can see that at the next slide. Some points. What I'm talking about and what we deal with here is specifically about the how of the budget and not about the what of the budget. So in our entity here, we don't care about the 3%, 60%, this kind of stuff, that other colleagues do that. But we have learned with the, well, one of the last crises, the Euro crisis in 2011, that we really need to stabilize the budgeting and that we need to have also, let's say, a more reliable budgeting, and something where you can really more believe into the figures that you see in the budget. And all of that, of course, against the background that we have high debt on the one hand and need to contain that. On the other hand, we have high investment and other needs. So at the time and since then, we have in the legal acquis and our legal base of the EU covered, for example, a better basis for reliable fiscal statistics. I can't really emphasize more that how important it is to have that, because that's the start of everything. This has been really much improved over the last, say, 10, 12 years. We have rules on how the budgetary forecast, the macroeconomic forecast underlying the budgets have become more reliable, less, let's say, positive biased, on fiscal rules in the member state, medium-term planning, on independent checks and balances and all of that. So all that is nowadays covered by law since 12 years. Then we have a softer approach where we do not have any legal base, but we engage with member states in mutual learning and peer reviews. We give technical support on things like spending reviews, on public investment management, on disaster risk financing, which becomes more and more important because we have more of these disasters due to climate change, and they always come as a surprise for fiscal policy. And woof, your debt goes up or your investment budget is gone because you use it elsewhere. And we do also a lot on performance budgeting, specifically on green budgeting. So all of that has intensified in the last years, and we have established tools like expert groups and regular meetings here, web pages, and so on, to really encourage mutual learning and uptake of best practices among member states. A new element in the legal acquis with the ongoing reform of EU fiscal rules, which will hopefully then come into force in later this year, later this spring, is that we will require member states to really report on the risks, fiscal risks from climate change. So that will be quite, hopefully creating quite some dynamism. It is in the regulation, in the directive said this should happen to the extent possible, because nobody really know exactly how to do that. Member states have different approaches, but we can do a lot there to help. On the next slide, you will see some elements for success as we have seen it in all these work strands where we try to engage with member states and see where does something work, where does it maybe not work so well. And that is obviously the most important. First one is you need a shared understanding, you need awareness among the actors that something is really a problem, and not only something that you might raise on Sunday speeches, but do not yourself own as a problem. That's of course difficult to create, but I have to say in this sense, we are all winners from crisis. So we have all these impulse into the law from 2011, from the Euro crisis. We have it now from the Corona crisis with the new fiscal tools established at the EU level and an increased willingness really to learn about how to deal with a world where debts have again increased quite substantially. You need always, if you want to achieve anything, you need really comprehensive coverage. You need coordination between the different actors over the different line ministries. You can't have 15 different approaches for spending reviews in each ministry. For that, you need a strong central steering. I know many people don't like that, to hear that, but I mean, you need somebody who really runs the ship, often the Ministry of Finance, but can also be, let's say, at the Prime Minister office, so that you can give guidance, you can establish standards on how to do things, you have consistency in what happens in your national administration, you build up capacity, you ensure continuity, you can better communicate on things. So you need really a clear-cut responsibility on somebody, on some cell or a unit who runs the, let's say, the public investment management or the spending reviews and so on. As much as you can, base it on hard data, have quantitative targets, that's clear. Difficult, but really very useful if you can anchor it in budgetary processes. So if it does not run somehow independently, but if you have to do it again and again, when you present annual budgets, you have to say on how did you progress with your spending reviews, let's say, what kind of conclusions did you draw from it? That's also the last point here, the systematic monitoring, the reviewing, and making everything you do really public so that people can read about it, that you have more awareness, that you can see what's going on, that also the citizens see national administrations are engaged and are dealing with the issues. Of course, there are challenges. On the next slide. Of course, on the one hand, you have limited information. You don't know how to do something. We can help a little bit with our mutual learning things. We have technical support tools, but that, of course, remains an issue where we learn, but we cannot, let's say, afford to say, let's wait until we have the perfect method, and in 10 years' time, we know by 5 years earlier, we were running against the wall. So we need to start now and learn on the doing. The strict calendar of the budget process makes things, of course, difficult if you integrate it into the budgetary procedure. You might have capacity constraints. You might have a lack of political will. Again, there we benefit from crisis. Let's hope that we might in the future also continue with our work without having new crises. That would be then the last word on that. But let me just also refer the audience that on the presentation that you will find later on the homepage, there are 2 further slides with links to publications from our unit here on all these topics I have touched upon. So that was what I wanted to present. Thank you.
Christian, thank you so much. So bringing in that slightly different perspective there on the need for kind of more stable and reliable budgets, as you started off with saying, and setting out there the work in the EU level on the kind of legal rules on the statistics, the forecasts and the planning, but then some of that softer, as you said, the support that you provide on helping countries with their spending reviews. Disaster risk management becoming something really, really important now in this context, given the period that we've been through of all of the crises that governments have been dealing with. So as you said, they're looking ahead to new rules coming in on risks from climate change and natural disasters and how countries are going to build those in to their forecasts and their budgeting processes. And then echoing, I think, some of the points that Mark and Bart have already mentioned. So the need for comprehensive approaches, so more collaboration across departments within a public service. So as you said there, you were saying maybe having a strong central steering unit, but ensuring that there's consistency across those departments. Again, echoing the importance of good processes, good data, and good monitoring systems as well, and making it as transparent as possible for the public. And then also flagging up some of the challenges, and you've brought in there as well, which we will come on to, I think, in the questions in terms of this, the political will and the political support to make sure that you're making the right decisions for the medium and long term and not just for short term kind of political gain. Thank you so much to all of you there. Brilliant opening presentations there. We've already got lots of questions coming in. I do have some questions myself that came in advance, but I am going to kick off with that first question that came in from Elsie or Alice, I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing that right, Cook, saying, so this was to you, Bart, because it came after your presentation, but I'm going to put it to all three of you. It's a very simple, but I think brilliant question. How do we measure public sector productivity? Bart, I will start with you because we haven't heard from you for a while.
Yeah, no, well, thank you very much. And it is an important question, and I'll try not to be too boring on it because it is also a tough question and very technical. But let's just start with the way we would not want to do it and the way it is mostly done. And that is that because we don't have good output and outcome measures that we can aggregate nationally, statistical officers quite often make the assumption that input is output. So they look at wages, they deflate them for cost of living index, they look at some other investments that are being made, and then they assume what you put in is what's coming out. And that by definition means output is input is no productivity growth. And I think it's one of the reasons why productivity growth quite often comes up at zero. Also not negative, because that could also happen, of course. Now, there are better ways of doing it, and there's quite a bit of statistics and academic work on this. Back in 2005, there was a so-called Atkinson review here in the UK. It's a big report out there that we could perhaps send a reference to. It's still very real. That made a lot of recommendations on how public sector productivity can be improved. Now, essentially, it comes down to, instead of just measuring inputs, you try to measure activity. So take, for example, healthcare. You're going to look at the number of surgeries that are being done, the number of visits that patients are going to pay, the number of procedures that are being carried out. You try, that's very important, to adjust those measures for quality improvements, right? I mean, we won't want to say if people are longer days in hospital, it's more productivity. If we can get them out of the hospital faster and they're healthier, that would of course be better. So these quality adjustments can be made. And then you need to weight these different activities on the basis of the cost weights, the amount of resources that these organizations are spending on these kind of activities. Now, this is done in the UK. It's done in a few other countries as well. There's quite a big academic literature. In education, we see similar kind of improvements. There are a few other sectors in the economy, social care, for example, where we do see some of that work happening. And statistical agencies, I know, for example, that the Office of National Statistics in the UK is now, as part of the Chancellor's productivity improvement plan, trying to improve the statistics on this as well. For example, come up with better measures of the activities that the police, for example, is carrying out, and how we're weighing the importance of those activities according to the amount of resources that are being spent on it. So this is a short answer to a very important but complex question.
I was going to
say,
a lot
of mileage to be made.
We could probably do a whole webinar just on the measurement issue, couldn't we? But Mark, did you want to add anything in terms of this question to what Bart has set out there? Sorry, Mark, you're on mute. Sorry.
I did that on purpose because somebody came to the door and my dog was making a noise. So apologies for that. I think it's a really interesting question. I was just mulling it over there. I was when I was in local government, we were faced with the best value performance plan and all the audits that we had to do and all the KPIs and measures that we did. But it was just too onerous. It was ridiculous. I think in terms of measuring productivity, you've got to somehow measure it in outcomes. Outcomes to the people that you're serving, whether it's, people going into hospital, what are the outcomes that they're getting? In a local authority, the services that we provide, what are the outcomes that we're getting? And only by improving those outcomes can you say that the organisation as a whole is becoming more productive. I think if you're looking at internal staff productivity, which, we've touched upon a little bit in the discussion already, I honestly think it's can we measure the amount of staff that we move from back office functions to more strategic frontline services? And how much do we invest? What's the change in investment between back office and front office? Now, in order to get productivity savings, you're going to have to invest in the back office. We've already talked about that to make those productivity gains. But if all we do is invest and we get some new shiny tech, then we've really failed. The whole purpose of this is we can reduce the back office estate so that we can invest more in frontline services. And I don't know how to do it, but I think if we could get a way of measuring that transition of spend, investment, whether it be actual physical money or whether it be the movement of staff between back and front, I think that would be a great way to start measuring productivity gains that actually had a real outcome for the citizen or the area that they're serving.
Can I
Thanks,
make
Mark.
one quick remark, Siobhan, just
Sure,
to
Mark,
add
yeah.
on this? It's, to building on what Mark is saying, there's a very large gap between what is being collected in management of public sector organizations in terms of data, what's being used in auditing, and what's then being used in national statistics. And there's much opportunity to join up these kind of opportunities. That also makes it much more worthwhile to do this kind of onerous work that Mark is indeed describing of collecting these data. If these data serve a purpose, and you deal with them in a longer term period of time, you can, data help us to manage things better, but we have to do it very consistently. So there's a lot of mileage we can still make there.
And it's going to be the right data as well, measuring and recording the right data, again, linked to those outcomes and outputs that we want to achieve in the medium to long term. So.
And Christian, so coming to you, so you mentioned at the end of your opening remarks the importance of monitoring. So did you want to add anything to this question about how do we measure productivity? And there's also another question from the same person who's coming, which I'll ask you in a moment. But did you want to add anything to this? How do you measure productivity?
Well, yes, I mean, the monitoring, I meant really also more focused on the instrument I talked about, like the spending reviews or the public investment management, where you have, if you look at it, let's say individually, you can say, well, okay, what are best standards elsewhere, or what kind of maybe cost reductions I can find because I had a spending review. There are also international comparisons about, let's say, how much money is wasted in investment projects and how well you fare there. So there are some attempts, for example, from the IMF and so on. But what I wanted to add on that is simply maybe to some degree counterintuitive things. The first is that we really need a holistic way to look at it, because, for example, if you have a decent education policy, kids also learn about food and how to eat. For example, they might end up healthier. So that is a health policy thing, but you achieve it via education policy, just for example. So that you have these holistic interrelationships between the sectors to have in mind. And then in general, you have really difficulties probably to compare and to aggregate all that. That's just as a warning. It will be difficult to say that country A is more predictive than country B, because adding up all these different things is difficult. Not least also because maybe you have certain responsibilities at different levels of government, sometimes more central, sometimes municipal, and so on.
Yeah.
So at the micro level, you can do it, but comparing it, aggregating, very difficult.
Yeah, you're just showing there, just from that one example, you can see how complex this becomes when you do start to kind of make all of those connections and where you invest and where you actually see the outcome of that investment. Chris, and I'll come back to you in a moment with that other question for you, but I want to move on, as you say there, in terms of comparing different countries. So we've had a question in from Alexandra, who said this was going back to your point, but I think on the culture of innovation that we need to facilitate somehow. So on that culture of innovation and constant improvement, all of your thoughts on which countries are doing well and what does this look like? And what can we all learn from this, whatever country you're in? What can you learn from countries who are doing this well? And how can you change culture? Christian, I'll come to you first, because obviously you sitting in the European Commission, you get a sense of lots of different countries. Are there people who are doing better on this than others in terms of being more innovative and improving in the way that they help become more productive? I mean, I know you just said it was very difficult to compare and contrast, but does anybody stand out?
It's also difficult. I mean, okay, just some success stories, maybe some not so surprising and some maybe more surprising. But for example, you will not be surprised to hear that some of the Scandinavian countries really invest a lot in modeling. So if you want to hear something about climate impact and what kind of effect it has, they are quite advanced. Denmark is advanced there, for example. They have done a lot. But for example, in public investment management, in how to manage that also digitally and so on, we had quite positive developments in Greece. So they also used a lot of the programs that we had run, the the resources that were made available maybe for that, or the recommendations. So we have green budgeting advancement, for example, in Spain a lot, in Austria. So you can't, I mean, some countries you will time and again find Netherlands, Denmark as really advanced. For example, Netherlands in investment planning. I think Ireland also quite good in these kind of things. But you find it also in other countries in different fields. So you need really a well-developed public sector, quite capable to perform. So, and that sector needs some resources. So you will find it rather in some countries with traditionally a bit stronger public sectors.
Yeah. Thanks, Christian. Mark, because obviously you work, as you said, across those 4 different regions. Does anyone stand out for you in terms of this culture of innovation that can help in terms of transformation and productivity?
Yeah, there's a couple of areas actually. I think I started off by saying that we've had, the UK has been teetering on the financial brink, probably too strong, but bordering on recession for quite a while. But we're now starting to see other countries, and certainly in terms of their public services, fall into that area. I think the one region that we actually think is they've got their challenges, but they seem to be doing better than most is the Netherlands. And I although there's a big round of efficiency reviews and requests from central government in the Netherlands for spending cuts in the municipalities and places like that, actually they are adopting technology in a very refreshing way. I talked about this adopt rather than adapt. Don't try and replicate what you've got before. Embrace out of the box business solutions. And I must say that the Netherlands, certainly in the municipality space, we're seeing some really refreshing approaches to being able to do that. And actually, this year in January's prime time for go live. It's the start of their financial year. But I think this year in January we saw alone about 23 municipal governments going live on our new Born in the Cloud SaaS solution. And they were able to do so with a very minimal project because they adopted as much as they could out of the box and only changed and tweaked what they really needed to do. That's not only shortening the projects, it's shortening the amount of upfront CapEx investment that's needed. It's getting new value solutions out to their users, new productivity and efficiency gains out of their new users quickly, and driving much better value out of those solutions that they've got. So I certainly think the Netherlands are seeing that. In terms of other innovations, I know there's potentially a question around climate change and impact and what that might have. But and if you look at that, the Nordics are significantly way ahead in terms of that area than most of the regions in terms of the innovative thinking and measurements and investments that they're making in that space. So those are the 2 areas I would probably call out.
Thanks, Mark. Bart, did you want to highlight any pockets of good practice either in the UK or other countries in response to this question?
Well, I'm of course flattered by Mark's comment on the Netherlands, being Dutch myself, as you may have heard from my accent. Also, it shows to me that we always got to be careful not to think the grass is greener at the other side, because there are some real challenges in the Netherlands as well. But I do think there are some important observations to be made here, though, in those, both what Christian and Mark said. So one is that, yes, the Nordic countries do spend more on public services than other European countries. But spending doesn't necessarily mean you're therefore more innovative and therefore create more productivity. And I would challenge that in some of the Nordic cases. In fact, the spending yourself out of the problem can stand in the way of productivity and innovation. Whereas Greece, the other end, that got incredibly squeezed after the financial crisis, was forced to make very big changes, and there was a lot of innovation going on. And I do think actually in the case of the UK, where we are at that similar point that we say we have to change and innovate and create another culture if we want to continue to operate in this environment. What I do think is incredibly important, a couple of things that are important for continuous innovation, but one of them is to make sure that we bring in the right skills in government itself to deal with these public services, right? I mean, one of the problems that we sometimes have is that we sort of delegate this to professional organizations and let them deal with it. And therefore, for example, when it comes to spending or procurement, we don't necessarily have the technical expertise in-house to actually take the right decisions of allocating the money where it really should be. And for example, when it comes, for example, the public infrastructure problems that we're facing in the UK, for example, to a large extent due to the fact that a lot of technical expertise has disappeared from government itself, and therefore we're not necessarily spending the money in the right way that we should be doing. So I do think that is important. For example, I know in the case of the Netherlands, where there's a heavy reliance on trying to bring that technical expertise in government, so that so that allocation decisions are being taken in the right way. The other thing I would say, what's incredibly important for innovation is citizen feedback. So outcomes are important, understanding how these outcomes are impacting on people, understanding what it does to them, and then have the flexibility in organizations to make the changes is very, very, very important. And again, technology gives us a lot of opportunities to get that information, to process it significantly better. And I think that is creating the kind of flexibility and response in organizations that citizens really expect from our public services.
Thanks, Bart. And that brings me nicely onto the question which came in from Tallulah, which was, to what extent does local government public service market commissioning model allow for accountability and democratic processes to be integrated and upheld? So essentially, is commissioning linked to citizens, both in notion and practice? So I think this is exactly what you're saying in terms of when people are looking at local government spend, to what extent are citizens and the public brought into that process? You're saying the feedback, but maybe also in the decision-making process up front. And Christian, you mentioned the importance of kind of transparency around investments for the public as well. So just your thoughts on the importance of the citizen in some of these investment decisions as well. And do you think they are being brought into that process effectively? Mark, is this something that you consider in your work with organizations?
We do, but to a sense, but our solutions tend to be more directly back office focused. But as I spoke before, the more efficient you make the back office, the more you can invest in your front line. I think though there's a balance, and there is getting a balance right between citizens having an input into your financial planning, your piece like that. They certainly should have a voice, but it always needs to be tempered with the fact that the priorities of the citizens may not be able to be matched by the needs of the organization or the ability of the organization to deliver it. So I think there's a role, but I think it needs to be absolutely balanced, and you will always need to have the role of the government professional, the civil servant in the local authorities. You need to have that senior leadership in there that can actually drive. Now, citizen inputs, we were joking and laughing about the pothole situation in the UK at the moment. And, any citizen, it's top of the mind. Potholes in the street, potholes in the road, they need to be fixed and things like that. But government can't do it, and they can't do it all at once. And I think what we get locked into is this reactive process of just trying to put a sticking plaster over something to allow, to just quieten things down, when actually there's a little bit of sticking plaster, but it's got to be part of a longer term, wider term plan. Yes, we can have citizen voice within that, but it has to be balanced so that we're not just being totally reactive.
Thanks, Mark. Bart, I want to come back to you because you mentioned the importance of citizen feedback. Do you think we're getting the balance right in some of these decisions that are being made?
I think what Mark is saying is incredibly important. There's a downside to citizen feedback, and that is NIMBY behavior, right? So that's not in my backyard. So citizens will say what works for me, but doesn't necessarily work for my neighbor. And it's the responsibility of policymakers to balance those needs very well. So I think it's very important that citizens do provide their feedback, but also that is transparent communication about why we're allocating resources to particular purposes in local government, for example, in order to serve the needs of your entire population. The other thing I would say is that keeping this line short, putting a face to government at local level is incredibly important. But all these local councils are all facing similar problems. And the question is, how can we scale up that information that we get from citizens in order to take larger action at a higher level, at central level, at regional level, or provincial level in other countries? And again, I think that's where technology can really help. I mean, the information systems in public government are sometimes really, really weak. So there is a lot of information that is sitting there, it's not properly collected, not properly processed. I mean, a lot of private sector organizations would be gone if they would use information in the same way from their customers as we are using information from our citizens. So I think using that technology to get that information aggregated so that policymakers at higher levels and politicians can take right decisions in order to make longer term investments is really important. We were talking before this podcast, before this webinar, about potholes. And I would say, well, potholes, of course, every citizen wants to get potholes resolved, but potholes is just a symptom of the fact that we actually haven't reacted early enough in order to prevent those potholes from happening, which is really what government should be doing. And I think it's a really good example of how we can do better.
Thanks, Bart. Christian, I'll ask your thoughts on this issue as well, but I want to build on it because Claire has come in with a follow-up question saying, building on this, how can the most excluded groups be brought into shaping services, given that that would probably help create better outcomes, but also these groups might cost more because they create higher service demand, so that the value for money arguments might be different. So you were stressing the need for transparency and kind of publication of decisions, but to what extent can you make sure that that kind of consultation is as inclusive as possible? Do you give advice to member states on those kind of issues?
Well, thanks. Yeah, that last question deals really with how do we get the message across? How do we really address the citizens? That is a general question in its own for all parts of public government, in which we do not tell member states how to do it. I mean, we hope a bit that we are not too bad on our own homepages and so on. But that is something which the Commission cannot tell member states how to do it, because of the national characteristics and so on that play a role. We can, so I cannot really develop on that very much. It is, of course, important to get the citizens on board. What I wanted to say generally on the argument that has been here now presented, of course, it's important to get the balance right between the different interests. That's true. And you have an obvious conflict of interest with huge investment projects and so true. What we see overall is that in general, if there's trust in the society and also trust between citizens and the states, the authorities, then you have more rational discussions and can easier achieve a compromise. One element what we find in the area of fiscal policy important is this instrument of independent fiscal institutions. So what is the OBR in the UK? Office for Budget Responsibility, very strong institution, very, very good institution, really. And these institutions have become more common, are now obligatory in the EU. Some of them exist for a long time, like the Central Plan Bureau in the Netherlands, but many have only been established after this new legislation, after 2011 came in force. And one, let's say, main task of them, which you do not find in legislation, is to improve the quality of public debate on fiscal policy, to create ownership, to create understanding on what are you doing. Last element I wanted to say is simply that some parts of productivity and productive government measures can also be explained. I mean, if people like me, for example, living here now in Belgium, I see things that in my home country, which everybody has by now detected because of my accent, are considered impossible. So in Germany, an electronic file for patients in the health system, impossible. I mean, not imaginable. Data protection and so on. In Belgium, it exists for years. And you can take that example and say, well, if it exists here and the state is not falling apart or run by some data warlords, then it might also work in Germany. So you can create such a discussion.
Yeah, and that's where that sharing of information and being transparent and more collaboration across borders would be hugely helpful.
And also, if I may add, Siobhan, the room for experimentation, right? Because it also shows there's a tendency always to do the things we always did them.
Yeah.
And particularly in public sector, we quite often do not want to take too much risk, because when under high public scrutiny, it's very easy for policymakers and politicians to blow something up into a big scandal. So we have to create an environment in which we can do experiments, which we can be very transparent about. This is an experiment. It may work, it may not work. If it doesn't work, we won't continue to do it. And that will help us also to move things forward. And I think, again, in the private sector, we find it much easier to do because the stakes are not necessarily as high as they are in the public sector if something goes wrong.
Thanks. Okay, I love this question because it's going to take us down a slightly different path, but I think this is really important in terms of the workforce and skills. We've kind of mentioned that already, a couple of things. So this is from Scott, who's in Canada, and he said people in the Canadian government tend to move around quite a lot because that's the way they get promoted. But the problem with this is that there's a kind of loss of corporate history with people moving around. But I would say, building on some of the things you said, that also might be a loss of skills, developing deep skills in a particular area, all of which I think are probably important for productivity. So do you think there are some challenges in the way civil servants and public servants currently work and are organized that also go against productivity? Bart, I'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, it's a great question, because of course, a lot of the HR literature will tell you that rotation is a good thing because people get other experience. It makes organizations more flexible and so on and so forth. So we should not push back on this right away. I mean, the literature is fairly clear in showing that giving people new experiences helps them to develop and to grow in their in their job. However, it's very important to make a distinction between what we call codified knowledge and non-codified knowledge. So codified knowledge is knowledge that we can actually put on paper, we can hand it off to others. Non-codified knowledge is things that are building up in your head, but cannot be very easily transferred to somebody else. For example, just personal relationships with your customer or your citizens or things like that, and knowing particular situations and how to handle them. And there are many of those situations in government, particularly in local government. The closer you are to the citizen, the more likely it is that there's all this kind of information that if you take this person off a role and you put in somebody new, there's a long runway before that person will perform in the same role. So I think what is important here is not to have a cookie cutter approach and say everybody needs to be transferred, every 2 or 3 years to another job, because that's the way we do things. It's about who's going to be helped by this, both from a worker perspective as well as from a customer or a citizen perspective. And think about it more strategically. It requires management competencies to really think much harder about where the strengths in your organization are, where you can benefit from rotation, and from where you can. So I think a much more flexible approach in this, but not throwing away the principle, because lots of people benefit from new experiences in other jobs, and we should give them that opportunity.
Thanks, Bart. Christian, did you want to add anything on workforce?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, in the Commission, we rotate, not enforced in the sense that we have to do it after a specific amount of years, but it's more like should every 5 years, maybe earlier if you want. But after 5 years, maybe we talk a bit more between the head of unit and the staff member about it. And crucially, we also rotate throughout what is, let's say, our ministries, our directorate generals. So I have worked in 3 of them in 20 years now in the Commission. Many national administrations, I think, at least as far as I know it, you stay in one ministry, and you're happy if you are mobile inside that ministry. So you learn really a lot, and I mean, whenever you take in also people, new recruits who have maybe a background, let's say in local government or somewhere in the financial sector and so on, it freshens up the team. But of course, it should not be like every 5 years it has to happen, or every 3 years and everybody, because that would not allow us to take into account individual cases and so on. It also enforces to create this tangible knowledge that you can then transfer. Because if you don't have that, then people might think, well, I know what I do, I stick here around and fine, and then there are no handover notes or continuity papers and so on. And things are always done as they have always been done. And if you rotate, you enforce a bit of codification. So
Yeah.
in general, a very good thing.
Thanks. So I guess it's getting that balance right. Mark, we've got more questions coming in. So did you want to add anything to that question?
Yeah, just a point really there, and I think Scott makes a really good point. And it's why in organisations, having really strong recruitment capabilities, identifying the right people, the right skills, having the right remuneration packages to attract the best possible people is really good. And then, of course, having the ways of working, the culture, allowing them not to be bogged down in administrative things and allow them to spend more time doing strategic value add stuff. It's really important. I think actually moving is good, because if people develop those skills and move to other organizations, it's bringing those other organizations up as well. And what we need to do is make sure we've got really strong succession planning processes in place within all of our organizations so that we don't have single points of failure. So when people walk out the door, your finance system isn't unsupportable anymore because nobody else knows how to use it. And believe you me, I've been in that situation in the past. So I think staff mobility is a really good thing, but we must get better. We've talked a lot about financial planning and financial stability, and as much, if not more important, that is stability of your staff. Yes, we want people to move because it's good for them. It's good for organisations, both the receiving and it's staff moving allows other people to be promoted to other positions as well. But we've got to do it in a planned and coordinated way, and that is a huge skill that I think we still have a long way to go on in government to get that right.
Thanks, Mark. I can't believe how fast the time has gone. We've had a brilliant conversation, so I think we've got time for just one more question each. And actually, Christian, I'm going to give you a different question from the other two because we've got a specific question for you. So I'm going to come to you first, Christian. And the question for you, going back to, I think, because you were talking about spending reviews, is a simple one. Should spending reviews be part of the strict budget process? That was the question to you. From Elsie again, I think.
Part of a strict budgetary process. I mean, that would be a radical answer to really have it enforced, let's say, every 3 years, let's say, for every budget line. I wouldn't go that far because, I mean, that is a huge of resource input also. But in general, I mean, for broader policy sets regularly, yes, I think it would be a good thing to have it. And if you have it once, let's say across the board, policy field by policy field and so on, and draw conclusions and change things, then maybe the next one is no longer so resource intensive. So yes, it should be a regular process. It's similar like what we just had on the mobility. Regular, yes. Super rigidly, maybe not necessarily.
Yeah, thanks, Christian. And then I'm going to go to Mark and then to Bart on this one. And this, because this is UK focused. So this came from Tallulah and said, in England, how can the devolution, trailblazer and single funding settlements for Greater Manchester and West Midlands ensure a more joined up approach to public service delivery? So one, do you think they ensure a more joined up approach to public service delivery? And what role do local authorities play in this? So Mark, given what you do now and also your local authority background, your views on Tallulah's question.
I was dreading you coming to me on this one, actually, because I have sort of doubts around, whether this devolution is good. There's pros and cons, and I think we've still got a long way to go to really understand whether actually having devolved government really works, really makes a difference for the citizens. But the way that we can do it, and we can do it in a much more joined up way, is just to make sure that across all of the organisations that are contributing to that devolved government, that devolved sort of government area, be it Greater Manchester, be it West Midlands, whatever it may be, we've got to have systems that are clearly interoperable. And most modern systems, you can take data in and out of them very, very easily, and you can share data across organisations. But I think Bart touched upon earlier that actually the culture of sharing data is quite at a superficial level in government. There are still silos, which it's very, very protected. And even within organizations or, different departments are not always keen to share information with other colleagues in the department because they get caught up in, privacy and GDPR and all that sort of thing. So look, I think it's an opportunity, but I think it's as much about, the funding settlement. It's much about local community decision making as to where that funding is spent and how it's spent. But I think it's also a cultural change as well. And I think often it's that cultural change. It's the biggest barrier to actually making these devolved governments actually work. So.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I will come to you, but I was going to say, if we had time, I would have brought Christian in as well, because it'd be interesting from countries that have more of a federal structure. This is kind of the culture is already there, but we kind of hear there are pros and cons because it devolves decision making, but also creates new boundaries and new kind of barriers, as Mark was saying there. But we started with you, so I'm going to give you final thoughts on this issue of devolution and linking up across local authorities.
Yeah, it's really important. And again, you could spend a whole webinar on this because it's a really important topic. I always say, productivity gets done at all levels of government. It gets done at central government, it gets done at local government, and very importantly, it gets done at a regional government or federal government or provincial government in other countries than the UK. And actually, that intermediate level is very important for public sector productivity. For example, transport and infrastructure, public planning of space and land. These are things where you actually need a little bit of an intermediate level. You don't want central government to do this, but you also don't want local government to do that on its own, because these things have externalities, as we economists call it, both negative and positive. They affect your neighbor. And one of the problems that the UK is facing is that that intermediate level of government is very weak, doesn't really exist, except, of course, for the devolved governments in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So the way that we're fixing this in the case of the UK is through these combined authorities. Greater Manchester, where I am, West Midlands is another one. And the current government's plan, and probably the next government's plan as well, is to actually expand this idea of combined authorities across the country, because that is bringing more local authorities together in order to level up scale up some of these decisions, which, as I said before, is really important to scale this up. But I do agree that there is a risk that we fragment, because even those combined authorities can still be fairly small from some really important public sector decisions. And I think this is really what makes this complicated. This is a vast sector. We're talking about education and healthcare and the justice system, which we haven't even spoken about today, and pensions and so on and so forth. They all require different levels of coordination. Some need to happen very close to the local government. Some others are much better centralized. And I think finding the right way there is really important. And therefore, I do agree with Mark that although I'm probably a little bit more in favor of devolution than he sounds like, I also worry a little bit about still having too much fragmentation in order to make public sectors really more productive. We'll be successful in some areas, but it may actually be using constrained in other areas. And I do think that some other European countries, notably Germany, but maybe Christian can comment on that, has the advantage of having these stronger Länder governments that take responsibility for a lot of these public services.
Christian, we've got 1 minute. Did you want to come back at all on anything to do with kind of the devolved structures?
I would only want to say or remind that the average German Bundesland has 5 million inhabitants, and about 20 of the EU member states have 10 or less million inhabitants. So this question of devolution and so on depends also on this size.
Yeah.
I cannot really comment on the UK. I don't know the situation so closely.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Christian. And with that, we have come to the end of our time. I just want to say a huge thank you to the audience for sending in so many fantastic questions. I think that was one of the best webinars that we've had in terms of the number and quality of the questions that came in. But thank you also to our brilliant speakers, to Mark, to Christian, and to Bart. I think I was assuming when we were doing this webinar that we were going to be talking a lot about the kind of solutions maybe in the technology. And although that's really important, I think it's really interesting that you've all really highlighted kind of the need for culture change and collaboration and sharing of good practice. And I think that's such an important message for everybody to take away from the webinar. To everybody watching, we will have sent you a short questionnaire. I'd be hugely grateful if you could just take a couple of minutes to fill in that questionnaire, because it means that here at GGF we can keep giving you the webinars that are of most interest and usefulness to you. So thanks in advance from me if you could do that. We will also send around the link of this video so you can watch it again or share it with your colleagues who weren't able to watch today. And there will be an article in a couple of weeks, which we'll share with everybody, covering the key messages that came out of today's conversation. But I really, really enjoyed that. Thank you so much to our fantastic panel. Thank you to Unit 4 for being our knowledge partner for today. And I hope we see you all again at another one of our webinars very soon. We've had some more comments in from the audience saying they really enjoyed it. So ditto from me for that. Thanks for everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day wherever you are. Thanks a lot and goodbye for now.
Thanks.